My name is Dominique Jean-Louis. I'm a doctoral candidate in U.S. history at NYU. The Council for the Humanities Fellowship basically is aimed at scholars or young scholars who are interested in engaging with the public in their work. And the way I see it, that works in two ways. So on the one hand, I think it's aimed at people who see their work as having some kind of relevance to contemporary issues, to a public audience. And on the other hand, I think it's also for people who are interested in letting contemporary issues and a more community-minded or public engagement influence the kind of work they do on an academic level. So seeing public engagement as something that changes the questions you ask, changes how you approach those questions. It changes how you construct a narrative, especially for historians. So kind of seeing public humanities as working two ways. What I think this fellowship does best is it gives you a kind of methodology with which to approach the public audience. In your scholarly work, as a graduate student and particularly as a PhD student, you're really asked to think about how your interests and how your work connects to a larger field, but thinking about how your work connects to a broader public audience is a whole different set of tools. It's a different set of vocabularies. It's a different set of just mind frames that you really have to tap into. And this fellowship, I think, is great for someone who's just starting that work. If you're used to doing more public engagement, it's not that it wouldn't be useful, but I think they start you out with the basics. How do you connect your scholarly content base with a contemporary issue? How do you take what is a theoretical project and translate that into tangibles, things that people can look at and touch and see and engage with on a more visceral kind of way. So I think that methodology is important for people who are just starting out and hopefully who will go back and use that new knowledge and those new methodologies to influence the work that they're doing. I found that in our classes on op-eds, in our classes on doing museum work and other kinds of exhibit work, that's changed how I think about the narratives I'm writing. It changes how I want to tell a story because I'm thinking about it both in terms of how historians have told these stories before, but then other ways that people like to engage with history. It's not just always a linear historical framework. It's not always just connecting it to prior history. Sometimes people like to see something funny or something quirky or something that relates back to their own history. And as I write, I definitely find that I'm thinking back to things that people have told us during our workshops and during our webinars on how to best engage with new kinds of audiences while still doing your due diligence and connecting with a scholarly audience. I'm still in the process of winnowing down what my questions are. My project looks at Caribbean immigration to New York City in the post-civil rights era, and obviously that's a broad topic, and I use the lens of education to get at those issues a little bit more deeply, but I was still in the process of deciding what specific questions I was answering and where I was going to look for my answers. And so the fellowship was useful in that capacity because it helped me not just to hone in on what I was most interested in, but what other people from other fields were also interested in. So my background is I got my undergraduate degree from Columbia in comparative ethnic studies, which is a newer field, and it basically looks at identity in a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary way. So how identity is formed, how it influences people's existence in the world, how it influences larger political structures and international structures. So issues of identity were kind of central to my academic upbringing. And then after doing my undergrad, I worked doing undergraduate admissions for a very selective university. And that was very useful because it connected that scholarly inquiry of identity to how people connect with institutions, which I didn't know it at the time, but that was really my entry point into public humanities work. Because at the end of the day, when you are working in public humanities, that's kind of what you're doing. You're trying to understand how bigger institutions and bigger scholarly inquiry and the scholarly community, how that connects to people, how all those things kind of fit together. And so being in an employment context where I was asked to connect people to institutions and to get them thinking about where they fit in to a larger picture, I think really was the first thing that led me on the path to public humanities, aside from a larger just interest in community engagement and interest in connecting, the work I do to communities that I care about and to issues that mean a lot to me. So I think it was the combination of thinking about identity in a very scholarly way, but then putting that into practice as an admissions professional, and of course larger issues of education that come up when you're doing admission in a highly selective university, how people arrive at different kinds of schools and what kind of access they get when, and how that shapes the trajectory of someone's life. That's now something I deal with in my own work in a historical framework, but it definitely influences how I think of my work in terms of today's educational questions, in terms of possible solutions, possible policy. All those pieces kind of started to fit together, I think, between my academic work and then my employment afterward, and certainly in my graduate study, those kinds of things. I think in general, something that had come up a lot in our workshops here at NYU is just the way that thinking about the humanities broadly is important, obviously for garnering critical thinking skills and to really understand the role that the academy can play in a more contemporary framework. But I don't know, I think that the public humanities work, if anything, has really, because I'm not planning on going on into the academy after I received my PhD. My plan is to go into full-time public history work, either in a museum or historical society, nonprofit, that kind of a context. And what I've found really interesting is that seems to be what I'm most prepared for. I feel almost as though that my experience with this fellowship, it's taught me how to take my scholarly training and use it towards something that I find more interesting, more exciting, more useful, in a way that you both wouldn't get if you didn't have the kind of traditional structure of a PhD, but you also wouldn't get if you just had, public humanities training, if this were kind of a course that you took. I think it's important to really blend the two, so that you have the rigor and you have the content base and you have the know-how of anyone who's, an expert in their field as determined by having a PhD, but also in terms of this kinds of a fellowship, being someone who's able to translate those things and never, it sounds like a put down, but never developing bad habits as a scholar in terms of overusing jargon or just not thinking about the larger import of your work. You're asked to think about very specific topics as a historian. What are you doing that no one's done before? But if you're not connecting that to what we do know and what is common knowledge, then you can't really speak to a larger audience. As a historian, you're always presenting your work to a bunch of people who have read all the same books you've read, who have taken many of the same classes you've taken. But when you're engaging with the public, you're asked to really make that into more of a unified whole, and it's not enough to just present your work. You really have to present on behalf of a long line of people who have come before you, and then on top of that, make it interesting, make it fun. A lot of my public humanities work has mostly been working with teens and younger children in some cases, and that brings so much more light to the kind of work you do, because it's not until you're talking about your project to a 16-year-old that you find out what's cool. Presenting at a conference will not tell you what's cool about your work until you're talking to a 16-year-old and you're mentioning that, Caribbean immigrants in the 1970s were part of the black art scene in Basquiat, and their eyes kind of light up and they go, oh, I know about Basquiat. So you're like, oh, okay, that's the part of my work that I should maybe bring to you, I should headline with, because that's clearly what's capturing your imagination. And so that's the cool part, where you kind of bring it to a new audience and you find out what it is that's interesting about your project, because obviously it's only you that's going to care about the entirety of your project, right? Everyone else needs to find an entry point, and the more diversity you get in who you're talking to about your project, the more you understand what those entry points are. And yeah, I think this fellowship does a good job of also connecting you with other people that are interested in this kind of work. Like I said, I deal a lot with teen audiences and younger audiences, but a lot of my the other fellows, they do work in other kinds of communities. Their public engagement looks very different, whereas mine is, I focus a lot on conducting oral histories. We have other fellows that do film, other fellows that do archaeology, that do a lot of other kind of disciplinary backgrounds. And so it's just interesting to get their perspective as well in terms of how they conduct their own public engagement, how they see their project from a bigger framework. It's both very inspiring, but also very instructive on how to engage with that kind of work. And then also, I guess the last thing is that through this fellowship, you really find out what a small world it is in terms of people who are doing public humanities engagement. So you're connected to all these other people who are doing really cool things. And so once you're plugged into that community, it's a really welcoming one. And you really get to see all of the possibilities that are available in terms of career public engagement work, but also things that other scholars can do within the academy, you know, opportunities that where they can bring their work into a wider audience, you know, doing op-eds, doing radio and all these other kind of interesting fields that you can dive into. There are really not that many people doing it, and so once you're in, you really get to know that world quite well. And so other opportunities start opening up. I'll be starting another fellowship at the Museum of the City of New York this summer. So it's almost like once you're in, it kind of snowballs into a greater engagement with public humanities, which is always a good thing.